Alright, today's lesson. Here we'll be putting all of our moving parts together into our functions for sine and cosine. So these are the general equations: y equals a sine k times x minus b plus c, or with the cosine as well. So a, remember, represents amplitude. K is the value that helps you find your period, which is 2 pi over k. And then the B value is phase shift. Remember, it's always opposite inside the parentheses. And then vertical shift is that Z value. Okay? So for our examples, we'll do 2 of them where we need to state the amplitude, period, phase shift, and vertical shift. And then we need to graph. Okay? So here for the amplitude, remember it's always positive distance from the middle. So even though it says negative 3/4, it'll be a positive 3/4. Okay? The period is found by taking 2 pi divided by 2, gives me pi, so that's our period. Phase shift is that value that says plus pi over 6, so that means I'm moving to the left pi over 6 units. And then the negative 1 at the end means that I moved my graph down 1. Make sure you use words for here to describe how you're moving your graph. Okay? Now, before I can figure out how to graph or plug in values, I need to figure out my increment. So I'm going to take my period that is for this graph and divide it by 4. So I'm going to be in increments of 4. So now, using my intervals or increments of pi over 4, I can use those to plug into my graph. Okay, so then once I have these written down, I'm going to stop the video and plug them in, but I'll show you one of them just so you know what I'm doing. So then negative 3/4 times sine of 2 times 0 plus pi over 6 and minus 1. Okay, so I'm going to pause it and plug in or set up all the rest, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so now that I plugged them all in, I need to simplify them, and I will have to use my calculator for this because they all end up being decimals. So when I plug in 0 plus pi over 6 times 2, that gets me pi over 3. So sine of pi over 3 gives me square root of 3 over 2. So multiplying that to negative 3/4, I'll end up getting negative 3 square root of 3 over 8 minus 1. That's where the calculator comes in. So when I plug that in, I get negative 1.65. Okay, then for pi over 4, when I plot that, or plug that in, pi over 4 plus pi over 6 gives me 1/4 plus 1/6, so then that gives me 3/12 and 2/12, so then I'm getting 5/12 for my fraction. Then multiplying by 2 reduces it to 5 pi over 6. Okay, so then sine pi of 5 pi over 6 gives me 1/2, then 1/2 times negative 3/4 gives me negative 3/8, and then subtracting those two gives me negative 1 and 3/8, which is the same thing as negative 1.38. Okay, and so on and so forth when I plug these in. So I'm going to stop the video and fill in all the rest of the values. Okay, so those are all my decimals. You can go ahead and check your work. Stop and take a moment to do that. From here, we're going to plug those in and plot them on our graph. So using these values, remember 0 was negative 1.65, so that would be approximately okay, right there. Then we'd have negative 1.375, which for pi over 4, which would be right about there. And then for pi over 2 would be negative 0.35. So it would be up here. And then we get negative 0.63 for 3 pi over 4. Okay, and then for pi, I get negative 1.65 again. And just remember it repeats, so then I'll get the same kind of pattern. Okay. Now remember that because of our amplitude, we're going to go up to 3/4, or negative 1/2, or sorry, negative 1/4, because it's 3/4 away from our middle, which is negative 1 here. And then we'll go down to the bottom, which was negative 1 3/4. So my graph should look something similar to that. Okay, and that would be your graph. Okay, so let's do that for the second example. So I have y equals 5, 6 cosine of 1/2 times x minus pi over 4 plus 2. Okay, so here we're going to have an amplitude of 5, 6. Our period is found by taking 2 pi divided by our k value, which is 1/2. So remember that's the same thing as saying 2 pi times 2, which is 4 pi. Phase shift is negative pi over 4, so that means I'm moving it to the right. Pi over 4. And then plus 2 means I'm moving it up 2. Okay? So here to find my increments, I take 4 pi and divide that by 4. That gets me pi. So since I'm going in values of pi, and I'm only graphing between 0 and 2 pi, so that means I only have 3 values. So I'm going to go ahead and plug these in. I'm going to stop the video, take a moment to do that. So now when I plug 0, pi, and 2 pi into my function, that's what they look like. So for this one, if I plug in 0, remember it's negative pi over 4, times 1/2 will give me negative pi over 8. So there I need to use my calculator to begin with for cosine. So plugging that in, and then taking 5, 6 times that plus 2, I get a value of 2.77. When I plug in pi, that gives me 3/4 pi times 1/2 is 3 pi over 8. So cosine of 3 pi over 8 times 5, 6, and then adding 2 gets me a value of 2.32. And then when I plug in 2 pi minus pi over 4, I get 7 pi over 4 times 1/2 gives me 7 pi over 8. So cosine of 7 pi over 8 times 5, 6, then adding 2 gives me a value of 1.23. Okay, so then when I plot this on my graph, for 0 was 2.77, so it'll be right about there. And then 2.32 for pi would be right about there. And then for 2 pi was 1.23, so it's right about there. Now remember, we're only getting a portion of the graph because since our period was 4 pi, we should only have half of the graph. Okay, so then that's what our half would look like. Okay, have fun.